Tell him I do not have time for people who are not serious investors. The message traveled from the executive floor to the lobby in less than 30 seconds. What nobody inside Crawford Technologies knew was that those words were about to become the most expensive mistake of Ethan Crawford's career. Darius Whitmore looked up from the leather chair where he had been waiting and simply smiled. The young receptionist standing behind the marble desk seemed uncomfortable repeating the message. She could not have been older than 25. Her name tag read Emily. "I am very sorry, sir," she said quietly. Mr. Crawford's schedule suddenly changed. Darius nodded as if she had informed him that it might rain later that afternoon. "Thank you for letting me know." Emily blinked. Most people became frustrated after waiting nearly an hour for a meeting. Some demanded explanations. Others raised their voices. Darius did neither. He folded his hands and glanced around the enormous lobby. Sunlight streamed through 40-foot glass windows overlooking Midtown Manhattan. Employees moved quickly across polished stone floors carrying laptops, coffee cups, and the urgency that seemed to follow successful companies. On one wall, a giant digital display showed Crawford Technologies' stock price. Green numbers flashed beside the company logo. Investors loved the firm. Financial media praised its growth. Ethan Crawford was becoming one of the most talked about chief executives in the country. Yet none of that seemed to impress Darius. He sat quietly in a dark navy jacket, simple dress shirt, and well-worn leather shoes. Nothing about his appearance announced wealth. Nothing about him demanded attention. That was one reason people underestimated him. Across the lobby, two junior employees glanced in his direction. One whispered something to the other. Both laughed softly before continuing toward the elevators. Darius noticed but did not react. He had seen those looks before. The assumptions, the quick judgments, the invisible decisions people made within seconds of seeing him. After 48 years, surprise no longer accompanied them. A television mounted above the reception area played a business news channel with the sound muted. Market updates scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Darius watched for a moment before returning his attention to the city beyond the windows. Far below, yellow taxis moved through traffic like streams of light. The sight reminded him of another day many years earlier when he stood outside a different office building wearing a maintenance uniform beside his mother. She had worked long shifts cleaning corporate offices after business hours. Back then, he used to stare through glass walls and wonder what happened inside boardrooms. His mother always gave the same answer. "The people inside are not better than us," she would say. "They just sit in different chairs." The memory brought a faint smile to his face. At that exact moment, his phone vibrated once. A single message appeared on the screen. 3 words. "They are coming." Darius read the text and locked the phone again. Nothing in his expression changed. Nothing in his posture shifted. Yet somewhere 39 floors above him, Ethan Crawford was congratulating himself for avoiding a meeting he believed would waste his afternoon. And somewhere outside the building, black luxury sedans were already moving through Manhattan traffic toward the company's headquarters. Darius leaned back in the chair and quietly waited. He had learned long ago that truth never needed to rush. Eventually, it always arrived. 39 floors above the lobby, Ethan Crawford stood inside a glass-walled conference room overlooking Manhattan. The city stretched endlessly beyond the windows, its towers shining beneath the afternoon sun. Around the polished table sat senior executives reviewing quarterly projections displayed across a massive screen. Numbers climbed upward. Revenue exceeded expectations. Analysts were optimistic. Investors were confident. Everything appeared to be moving exactly as Ethan intended. He adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit and allowed himself a small smile. Success had become familiar. So had the feeling that he could identify opportunities and mistakes faster than everyone else around him. That confidence was one reason he had dismissed the visitor waiting downstairs. A vice president seated near the end of the table glanced at a tablet. "The investor who requested the meeting is still in the lobby." Ethan barely looked up. "Then he clearly has time to waste." A few executives laughed politely. "Do we know much about him?" someone asked. Ethan shrugged. "If he were important, I would already know who he was." The room returned to the presentation. Yet not everyone seemed convinced. One board liaison quietly reviewed a document before looking toward Ethan. His name is Darius Whitmore. Ethan frowned slightly. Never heard of him. The liaison nodded and said nothing further. Meanwhile, downstairs, the lobby continued its steady rhythm. Employees entered and exited through revolving glass doors. Couriers arrived carrying packages. Visitors checked in at reception. Darius remained exactly where he had been for nearly 2 hours. Calm, patient, unmoved. Emily occasionally glanced toward him. The longer he sat there, the stranger the situation felt. Most rejected visitors eventually left. Darius seemed perfectly comfortable waiting. At one point she finally approached him with a bottle of water. "You have been here a long time," she said. Darius accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you." "You are not upset?" she asked. Darius looked around the lobby. Being upset rarely improves a situation. Emily laughed softly. "I wish more people believed that." Darius nodded. "Most people think patience means weakness." Before she could respond, an elderly janitor slowly pushed a cleaning cart across the marble floor. His name tag read Frank. He paused beside a nearby bench and adjusted a wheel that had become stuck. Without hesitation, Darius stood and walked over. "Need a hand?" Frank smiled. Would not say no. Together they lifted the cart slightly and freed the wheel. The problem took less than a minute to solve. "Appreciate it," Frank said. "No problem." The two men exchanged a few friendly words before Frank continued down the hallway. Emily watched the interaction from behind the reception desk. Most visitors acted as though maintenance staff were invisible. Darius spoke to Frank as though he mattered. Upstairs, Ethan's meeting continued. Downstairs, Darius returned to his chair and gazed through the enormous windows toward the streets below. His phone vibrated once again. This time there was no message. Only a photograph that appeared on the screen. An older woman wearing a maintenance uniform smiled back at him. Darius looked at the image for several seconds before locking the phone. Outside, dark luxury sedans were beginning to turn onto the avenue. Inside the conference room, Ethan Crawford remained completely unaware that the afternoon he thought he controlled was slowly moving in a very different direction. The afternoon sunlight shifted across the lobby floor, stretching long reflections over the marble as the hours moved forward. Most visitors came and went without leaving a memory behind. Darius Whitmore remained exactly where he had been, seated quietly near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Employees had stopped wondering whether he planned to leave. The more unusual question now was why he seemed so comfortable staying. Emily noticed it every time she glanced up from the reception desk. There was no frustration in him, no nervousness, no desperation to be seen. He carried himself like someone who had already arrived long before entering the building. Across the lobby, Frank continued his afternoon cleaning route. The elderly janitor pushed his cart slowly past conference rooms and waiting areas before eventually returning to the main entrance. This time he stopped beside Darius without hesitation. "You still here?" Frank asked with a grin. Darius smiled. "Looks that way." Frank laughed softly. "Most people would have walked out an hour ago. Most people probably have better places to be. And you do not?" Darius looked toward the busy streets outside. Yellow taxis flowed through traffic. Pedestrians crossed intersections beneath the glow of changing signals. "I learned a long time ago that some things are worth waiting for." Frank nodded thoughtfully. There was something about Darius that reminded him of people from another generation. People who listened more than they talked. People who treated strangers with respect before knowing their titles. "You work in finance?" Frank finally asked. Darius chuckled. "Something close to that. You do not sound like most finance people." "That might be a compliment." Both men laughed. Nearby, Emily found herself smiling. Their conversation felt strangely refreshing inside a building where most discussions revolved around profits, market share, and quarterly targets. Frank rested both hands on the cleaning cart. "You know, I have been in this building almost 27 years. Darius looked interested. "That is impressive. I have watched executives come and go. Different names on the doors. Different logos on the walls. Same building." He paused. "Funny thing is, the people who matter most are usually not the ones making the most noise." Darius studied him for a moment before nodding. That sounds like wisdom. Frank shrugged. It sounds like old age. The two men shared another laugh. Upstairs, Ethan Crawford's meeting was finally ending. Executives gathered their tablets and notes. Discussions shifted toward upcoming partnerships and expansion plans. Ethan stood near the window overlooking the city. He felt confident. The company was thriving. The future looked bright. One of his assistants approached with a tablet. The visitor is still downstairs. Ethan rolled his eyes slightly. Persistent. Should security ask him to leave? The question hung in the air for a moment. Ethan glanced at the screen displaying Darius's name. Then he shook his head. No. If he wants to waste his afternoon sitting in a lobby, that is his decision. The assistant nodded and walked away. Ethan never noticed the uneasy expression on her face. Downstairs, Darius's phone vibrated once more. He looked at the screen. Another short message. 5 words this time. They are almost there now. Darius read it and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Nothing in his expression changed. Yet outside the building, 3 black luxury sedans had just turned onto the avenue. Their polished surfaces reflected the sunlight as they approached the front entrance. Frank noticed them first through the glass. Emily followed his gaze. Something about the arrival felt important. Darius simply remained seated, watching the city beyond the windows as though everything was unfolding exactly as expected. The black sedans rolled to a smooth stop outside the building entrance, their polished surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun like dark mirrors. The movement immediately caught the attention of people throughout the lobby. Security personnel exchanged quick glances. Employees walking past the windows slowed their pace. Even Emily looked up from the reception desk. Something about the arrival felt different from the usual flow of executives and clients. Darius Whitmore noticed the vehicles as well, but his reaction was almost invisible. He simply folded his hands and remained seated. Frank, meanwhile, pushed his cleaning cart closer to the windows and quietly watched. "Looks like somebody important is here," he said. Darius smiled faintly. "Maybe." The front doors opened. 3 men and 2 women stepped inside. They were dressed professionally but carried themselves with the confidence of people accustomed to making significant decisions. Their expressions were serious, purposeful. None stopped at reception. None looked around uncertainly. They walked directly toward the elevator bank, as if they already knew exactly where they were going. Emily noticed one detail immediately. Every visitor wore a small lapel pin bearing the insignia of Crawford Technologies' board of directors. Her eyes widened slightly. The board almost never visited headquarters without advance notice. Upstairs, Ethan Crawford was reviewing final notes from the afternoon meeting when his assistant hurried into the conference room. "Sir," she said carefully, "the board has arrived." Ethan looked up. "Today?" "Yes. Nobody informed me. Apparently it was decided this morning." A small crease appeared between Ethan's eyebrows. Unexpected board visits were rarely random. "Did they say why they are here?" The assistant shook her head. "No, sir." Ethan stood and adjusted his jacket. "Fine. Prepare the executive conference room." Despite his calm appearance, a faint uneasiness settled in the back of his mind. Downstairs, the elevators had already carried the board members toward the upper floors. The lobby returned to its normal rhythm, but Emily could not stop thinking about the timing. First the mysterious visitor, then the board, then those strange messages on Darius's phone. She glanced toward him again. He seemed completely at peace, as though he were waiting for a train he knew would arrive exactly on schedule. "Do you know why they are here?" Emily finally asked. Darius looked toward the elevators. "People usually come when something important needs attention." The answer sounded simple, yet somehow it felt like more than that. Frank chuckled. "You talk like a man who already knows the ending of the movie." Darius laughed softly. "Life usually surprises me too." But even as he said it, a warm memory surfaced. He remembered standing beside his mother in this very building nearly 30 years earlier. Back then the floors were older. The walls were different. Yet she had looked around the corporate offices and told him something he never forgot. "One day, people will underestimate you," she said. "Do not waste energy proving them wrong. Let time do the work." Darius had carried those words through every boardroom, every negotiation, and every challenge that followed. Upstairs, Ethan entered the executive conference room expecting a routine discussion. Instead, he found several board members already seated around the table speaking quietly among themselves. The chairman stood near the window overlooking Manhattan. He did not smile when Ethan entered. "Good afternoon," Ethan said. "I was not expecting visitors." The chairman nodded once. "We know." The response felt oddly cold. Ethan took his seat. For the first time that day, confidence gave way to curiosity. He had no idea that the man he refused to meet was still sitting in the lobby below. And he certainly had no idea that before the afternoon ended, that same man would become the center of every conversation in the building. The atmosphere inside the building had changed, even if nobody could fully explain why. Employees moved through the lobby with the same hurried pace as before, yet conversations seemed quieter. Eyes lingered longer on the elevators. The unexpected arrival of the board had spread through the company faster than any official announcement. Darius Whitmore remained seated near the windows, watching the late afternoon light slide between the skyscrapers outside. Manhattan was beginning its slow transition toward evening. Reflections of passing traffic shimmered across the glass. His phone rested silently beside him. For the first time all day, no new messages had arrived. Upstairs, the executive conference room felt noticeably different from the confident environment Ethan Crawford had entered only minutes earlier. The chairman of the board sat at the far end of the polished table. Several directors reviewed documents while others exchanged brief comments that Ethan could not quite hear. The lack of information bothered him. Normally he controlled the flow of every important meeting. Today he felt as though he had walked into a conversation that began before he arrived. "Is there a problem?" Ethan finally asked. The chairman folded his hands. "That depends on how prepared we are for the future." Ethan forced a smile. "The company is performing well. The numbers are strong," one director agreed. "But growth requires more than numbers." The answer only deepened the uncertainty. Meanwhile, downstairs, Frank parked his cleaning cart near a column and sat on a nearby bench for a short break. "You know," he said, looking toward Darius, "I have seen 3 chief executives in this building." Darius smiled. "Only 3. Feels like 30. Both men laughed. Frank shook his head. "The funny thing is, every one of them believed they were the smartest person in the room." Darius glanced toward the elevator bank. "And were they?" Frank thought for a moment. "The best leaders were never the ones trying to prove it." The words settled comfortably between them. Nearby, Emily pretended to organize paperwork while secretly listening. She found herself increasingly curious about the quiet visitor, who had spent the entire afternoon treating everyone with kindness. Most important guests barely acknowledged reception staff. Darius thanked her every time she brought him water. He remembered Frank's name. Even held. The door opened for delivery workers entering the building. None of it seemed calculated. It simply appeared natural. A soft chime sounded from one of the elevators. Several executives stepped out and crossed the lobby carrying folders and tablets. One of them glanced toward Darius and slowed almost imperceptibly before continuing. Another did a double take. Neither spoke. Yet Emily noticed both reactions. Darius noticed them too, but his expression remained unchanged. High above them, the board meeting continued. A director opened a presentation containing projections for a proposed expansion strategy. Ethan studied the slides carefully. Then he noticed something unusual. The final pages referenced funding that had not yet been approved. "Where is this capital coming from?" he asked. Several board members exchanged brief looks. The chairman answered, "From a partner we have been discussing for months." Ethan frowned. "I have not met this partner." "No," the chairman replied calmly. "You have not." Silence followed. Not hostile. Just heavy. Ethan suddenly remembered the investor still waiting downstairs. The thought appeared and vanished just as quickly. Surely there was no connection. Yet for reasons he could not explain, a faint uneasiness settled deeper in his chest. Outside the conference room windows, the sun continued descending toward the horizon. Down in the lobby, Darius Whitmore quietly checked the time. Then he stood for the first time in nearly 3 hours, adjusted his jacket, and looked toward the elevators as if he knew something everyone else was about to learn. The elevators opened with a soft chime that seemed louder than usual in the late afternoon quiet. Darius Whitmore stood near the windows with one hand resting lightly against the back of the chair he had occupied for most of the day. Emily noticed that his attention had shifted. He was no longer watching the streets below. He was watching the elevator doors. Across the lobby, Frank followed his gaze and slowly rose from the bench beside his cleaning cart. Neither man spoke. Something important was approaching. Several senior executives stepped out first, moving quickly across the marble floor. Then came two members of the board. They were speaking quietly among themselves until one of them looked up and saw Darius. The conversation stopped immediately. Both individuals smiled. It was not the polite smile reserved for acquaintances. It was the warm recognition people showed someone they genuinely respected. Emily noticed it instantly. So did Frank. One of the directors changed direction and walked straight toward Darius. "Good afternoon," he said. "I hope we did not keep you waiting too long." Darius smiled. "Not at all." The director shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for coming." Emily nearly dropped the folder she was holding. "Thank you for coming." The words echoed in her mind. Throughout the day, nobody had treated Darius as someone important. Yet a member of the board had just greeted him like a valued guest. The second director joined them. "The chairman is ready whenever you are." Darius nodded. "Perfect." Frank watched the exchange with growing curiosity. The quiet man who spent hours talking with a janitor and sitting patiently in the lobby clearly was not who everyone assumed he was. Darius turned toward Emily before leaving. "Thank you for your kindness today." Emily blinked. "You are welcome, sir." Then, almost as an afterthought, Darius added, "You handled a difficult situation professionally." Her cheeks warmed slightly. No executive had ever thanked her for that before. Upstairs, Ethan Crawford remained seated in the conference room while discussions continued around the table. Yet his concentration was fading. The unexplained tension in the room had become impossible to ignore. Several directors kept checking the time. Others glanced occasionally toward the door. Finally, Ethan leaned forward. "Is someone else joining us?" The chairman looked at him. "Yes." "An investor?" Ethan asked. "A partner," the chairman replied. Before Ethan could ask another question, there was a knock at the door. The room immediately became still. One by one, conversations ended. Several directors straightened in their seats. Ethan frowned. The reaction felt unusual. Important guests visited the company regularly, but he had never seen board members prepare themselves quite like this. The door opened. Outside, footsteps approached along the hallway. Down in the lobby, the elevator doors closed behind Darius as he rose toward the executive floors. His reflection appeared briefly in the polished metal walls. Calm eyes. Steady expression. The same quiet confidence he had carried all day. He remembered his mother's voice once again. "Let time do the work." The elevator continued upward. 30 floors. 35. 38. Above him, an entire boardroom waited. Inside that room sat a chief executive who still believed he understood exactly who belonged at the table. In less than a minute, that certainty was about to disappear. The conference room door opened slowly, and every eye in the room shifted toward the hallway beyond it. Ethan Crawford remained seated near the center of the polished table, his fingers resting lightly on a stack of reports. For a brief moment, nobody entered. Then Darius Whitmore appeared in the doorway. The room immediately changed. It was not dramatic. No one gasped. No one stood abruptly. Yet something subtle happened that Ethan noticed immediately. Several board members smiled. Others straightened in their seats. The chairman himself rose and walked toward the entrance. Ethan stared. He recognized the man instantly. The visitor from the lobby. The investor he had refused to meet. For a second, his mind struggled to connect the image in front of him with the assumptions he had carried all afternoon. The chairman extended his hand warmly. "Darius, thank you for coming." Darius shook it. "Thank you for inviting me." The exchange was simple, yet the respect behind it was impossible to miss. Ethan felt a faint tension settle into his chest. Around the table, directors greeted Darius by name. One asked about his flight. Another mentioned a recent philanthropic project. A third congratulated him on a successful acquisition that had apparently closed the previous quarter. The familiarity surprised Ethan. This was not a stranger. This was clearly someone the board knew well. Darius acknowledged each greeting with the same calm humility he had shown throughout the day. He did not dominate the room. He did not demand attention. Yet attention seemed to move naturally toward him anyway. The chairman gestured toward an empty chair near the head of the table. "Please." Darius thanked him and took his seat. Ethan could not ignore the placement. The chair was not positioned among ordinary guests. It sat closer to the board leadership than to company management. Across the table, one director opened a folder and smiled. "We have been looking forward to this meeting for months." Darius nodded. "I know how difficult schedules can be." The comment carried no edge, no accusation. Yet Ethan felt it land anyway. He remembered the message he had sent downstairs. "Tell him I do not have time for people who are not serious investors." Suddenly those words sounded very different inside his own head. The chairman returned to his seat. "Now that everyone is here, we can begin." He looked around the room before continuing. "As you all know, the company's next stage of growth depends on securing the right strategic partner." Several executives nodded. Ethan listened carefully. He already knew the expansion plan required significant capital. What he did not know was why every road seemed to be leading back to the man he had dismissed. One director clicked a remote, and a presentation appeared on the large screen. Charts, forecasts, and market projections filled the display. Then a new slide appeared. At the top was the name of an investment group Ethan immediately recognized. It was one of the most influential firms in the country. Billions of dollars under management. Decades of successful investments. His eyes widened slightly. He had spent months hoping to secure their support. The director glanced toward Darius before speaking. "We are fortunate that the founder has agreed to join us today." Silence filled the room for half a heartbeat. Ethan slowly turned his head. Every board member was looking toward Darius Whitmore. And for the first time all day, Ethan Crawford began to realize that the man he left waiting in the lobby might be far more important than anyone in the building. For several seconds, Ethan Crawford said nothing. The presentation screen continued. Glowing at the front of the room, displaying the name of one of the most influential investment firms in the country. Yet the numbers and charts no longer held his attention. His focus remained fixed on Darius Whitmore. The investor sat calmly near the head of the table, hands folded, expression relaxed. There was no sign of triumph, no satisfaction, no attempt to make anyone uncomfortable. That somehow made the situation even more unsettling. Around the room, directors began discussing long-term expansion opportunities, but Ethan found himself replaying the events of the afternoon. The lobby, the rejected meeting, the assumptions he had made before learning anything about the man sitting across from him. One director clicked to the next slide. Market projections appeared across the screen. "As everyone knows," she said, "our proposed expansion requires a strategic partner who understands both growth and long-term stability." Several board members nodded. The chairman looked toward Darius. "That is one reason we were excited when your team expressed interest." Darius smiled politely. "We believe the company has potential." Ethan listened carefully. Potential. Not certainty. Potential. The distinction mattered. For the first time, he realized this meeting was not merely a formality. The future of the company had not been secured. It was still being decided. One board member leaned forward. "Your track record speaks for itself. Every organization you have partnered with has grown significantly." Another added, "And your community investment initiatives have become a model for the industry." Ethan looked from one speaker to another. The respect in their voices was unmistakable. This was not admiration based solely on wealth. It was trust earned over many years. Darius accepted the praise with visible discomfort. "I have always had strong teams," he said. "Success is rarely an individual accomplishment." The answer drew several smiles. Ethan noticed something important. Every time someone highlighted Darius's achievements, he redirected attention toward others. It was the opposite of what Ethan often witnessed among executives. The chairman opened a folder resting beside him. "There is another reason we wanted this meeting to happen in person." His tone grew more serious. Character matters when choosing long-term partners. The room became quieter. Ethan felt his stomach tighten slightly. The chairman continued. Numbers tell us what a company has done. Character tells us what it will do when conditions become difficult. Several directors nodded in agreement. Darius remained silent. He did not look toward Ethan. He did not need to. The words already hung heavily in the room. Outside the conference room windows, the sun had nearly disappeared behind the skyline. Long shadows stretched across Manhattan. The city lights below were beginning to flicker to life. Inside, the conversation shifted toward values, leadership, and organizational culture. Topics Ethan normally handled with confidence. Yet today, every discussion seemed to reveal a contrast he could not ignore. The investor he had dismissed without a meeting had spent the afternoon speaking with a receptionist and a janitor. The same investor was now being treated as one of the most respected people in the room. Then the chairman closed his folder and looked directly at Darius. Before we move forward, there is one question everyone here would like answered. Darius raised an eyebrow slightly. What is that? The chairman smiled. After everything that happened today, why did you stay? Silence settled across the room. Every eye turned toward Darius. And for the first time since entering the building, Ethan Crawford found himself wanting to hear the answer just as much as everyone else. The question lingered in the conference room long after the chairman finished speaking. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan glowed beneath the first lights of evening. Inside, nobody reached for a tablet. Nobody checked a phone. The room had become completely still. Darius Whitmore sat quietly for a moment, considering the question. Then he smiled. Because I have been underestimated before. His answer was simple. Yet it carried a weight that immediately commanded attention. Several directors exchanged thoughtful glances. Ethan Crawford remained silent. Darius looked toward the skyline beyond the glass. When I was a boy, my mother cleaned office buildings at night. Sometimes she would bring me with her because she could not afford a babysitter. A few people around the table leaned forward. I remember watching executives leave their offices. Most never noticed us. Few did. The ones who stopped to say hello were usually the people my mother respected most. His voice remained calm. There was no anger in it. No resentment. Only memory. One evening I asked her whether it bothered her when people looked down on her. The room remained silent. Darius smiled faintly. She told me something I never forgot. She said, "Never let someone else's opinion become your identity." The chairman nodded slowly. He had heard the story before, but it seemed no less powerful. Darius folded his hands. So when I arrived today and discovered I would be waiting, I had a choice. I could leave. I could become offended. Or I could remember what my mother taught me. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. Every word seemed directed nowhere and everywhere at the same time. One director spoke up. Most people would have walked away. Perhaps, Darius replied. But I was not there to protect my pride. I was there to evaluate a partnership. The distinction settled heavily across the room. Darius had approached the day with a purpose larger than personal feelings. That realization only deepened the respect many already felt for him. Another director smiled. And what did you learn? A few quiet chuckles moved around the table. Darius laughed softly as well. I learned that buildings are often more honest than boardrooms. Several eyebrows lifted. What do you mean? The chairman asked. Darius glanced toward the door. The receptionist treated me with professionalism even when she had very little information. The janitor treated me with kindness because that is who he is. Both showed character without knowing who I was. Ethan felt a tightening in his chest. He already knew where the conversation was going. Darius continued. Titles reveal authority. They do not always reveal character. Silence returned. This time it lasted longer. The statement was not an accusation. It was simply true. That made it impossible to dismiss. Outside, traffic lights reflected against the surrounding towers. The city continued moving while something important shifted inside the room. The chairman finally broke the silence. That perspective is one reason we wanted you involved. Several directors nodded. Then the chairman opened another folder resting beside him. I believe it is time everyone understands the full picture. Ethan looked up. The chairman turned several pages before sliding a document toward the center of the table. Our expansion project is not merely seeking investment. He paused. It depends on it. Ethan frowned. Depends on it? The chairman met his eyes. Without this partnership, our next phase cannot move forward. The room became quiet once again. Then the chairman looked toward Darius and smiled. And there is something else Mr. Crawford does not know yet. For the first time all evening, every person in the room turned toward Darius Whitmore. The room remained silent as the chairman's words settled over the table. Outside, the last traces of daylight faded behind the Manhattan skyline, leaving the glass walls filled with reflections of the people inside. Darius Whitmore sat calmly while every eye remained fixed on him. Ethan Crawford felt the tension building with every passing second. He knew something important was coming. What he did not know was how deeply it would affect the future of the company he had spent years building. The chairman folded his hands. For the past 18 months, we have been discussing a strategic partnership that could transform this organization. Several directors nodded. We have reviewed dozens of possibilities. International firms, private equity groups, institutional investors. He paused and looked directly at Darius. In the end, there was only one partner we unanimously trusted. Ethan glanced toward the presentation screen. The logo of the investment group still glowed brightly above financial projections. The chairman continued. Mr. Whitmore is not simply a representative of that organization. The room grew even quieter. He founded it. For a brief moment nobody moved. Ethan stared at Darius. The realization hit him all at once. The investor he refused to meet was not a messenger, not an advisor, not a junior representative. He was the founder, the architect behind one of the most influential investment firms in the country. Several executives who had not previously known the full story exchanged stunned looks. One vice president actually leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. Darius offered a modest smile. I have had a lot of help over the years. The chairman laughed softly. That sounds exactly like something you would say. More smiles appeared around the table. Ethan noticed something that made the moment even harder to process. Nobody seemed impressed merely because Darius was wealthy. They respected him because they trusted him. There was a difference. And Ethan suddenly realized he had spent years becoming successful while overlooking that distinction. The chairman opened another document. There is one more detail everyone should understand. He slid the paper toward the center of the table. The proposed expansion is projected to create thousands of jobs over the next decade. A director nodded, particularly in communities that have historically been overlooked. Darius listened quietly. That commitment was important to me, he said. Growth means very little if it only benefits people who are already doing well. Several board members agreed immediately. Ethan found himself studying the man across from him. Throughout the entire afternoon, Darius had never once mentioned his achievements. He had never introduced himself with a title. He had never demanded recognition. Yet every new detail revealed a larger picture. The chairman leaned forward. Which brings us to the final point. His voice became serious again. Before moving forward, we wanted to evaluate whether our values aligned. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. He knew exactly what that meant. This meeting had never been only about money. It had been about leadership, character, judgment, the qualities Darius himself had spoken about earlier. The chairman turned toward Darius. After everything you experienced today, do you still believe this company is worth partnering with? The question landed like a stone in still water. Every executive froze. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. For the first time all day, the future of the company seemed to rest not in a spreadsheet or a quarterly report, but in the answer of one man who had spent 3 hours waiting quietly in a lobby while everyone else decided who they thought he was. The question hung over the conference table like a weight nobody could ignore. Outside the windows, Manhattan sparkled beneath the evening sky. Streams of headlights moved through the streets below while reflections of the city danced across the glass walls surrounding the room. Yet inside, every person remained focused on Darius Whitmore. The chairman's question had shifted the balance of the entire meeting. Do you still believe this company is worth partnering with? Ethan Crawford sat motionless. For the first time since becoming chief executive, he felt completely powerless to control what happened next. The future expansion plan, the jobs, the investment, the opportunities, all of it seemed to rest on the answer of the man he had refused to meet. Darius remained silent for several seconds, not because he was trying to create drama, because he was genuinely considering the question. Finally, he looked around the table. "Yes," he said. A collective breath seemed to move through the room. Several executives visibly relaxed. Ethan felt tension leave his shoulders before he even realized he had been holding it. Darius smiled slightly. "I believe the company is worth partnering with." The chairman nodded. "May I ask why?" Darius looked toward the skyline. "Because organizations are not defined by their worst moment. They are defined by what they learn from it." The room became quiet again. "If I judged every company by a single mistake, I would never invest in any of them." Several directors exchanged approving glances. Darius continued, "What matters is whether people are willing to grow." His eyes briefly moved toward Ethan. Not accusing, not angry, simply honest. Ethan felt the weight of that look more than any criticism could have achieved. Throughout the day, Darius had every reason to be offended, every reason to walk away. Yet he was choosing something else entirely. Perspective. The chairman smiled. "That answer does not surprise me." One director laughed softly. "It should surprise the rest of us." More smiles appeared around the table. The atmosphere slowly shifted from tension toward reflection. Ethan finally cleared his throat. Every eye turned toward him. For a moment he struggled to find the right words. The confident executive who normally dominated meetings seemed strangely absent. "Mr. Whitmore," he began. Then he stopped. The title suddenly felt too formal, too distant. "Darius." The investor looked toward him. Ethan took a slow breath. "I owe you an apology." Silence returned. This time it felt different. More personal. More important. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before continuing. "I made assumptions before I knew anything about you." The admission was difficult. Yet once spoken it felt necessary. "I judged you based on appearance instead of facts. And because of that, I failed to show the respect you deserved." Nobody interrupted. Nobody rushed the moment. Darius listened quietly. Ethan continued. "That was my mistake." The room remained still. Then Darius smiled. Not triumphantly. Not as someone who had won. As someone who understood. "Thank you," he said simply. The sincerity in his voice made the moment even more powerful. There was no lecture. No public embarrassment. No demand for further explanation. Just gratitude for honesty. Ethan found that response unexpectedly humbling. The chairman looked around the room. "Well," he said warmly, "that may be the most productive conversation we have had all year." Quiet laughter spread through the conference room. For the first time that evening, the tension fully eased. Yet Ethan knew something important had happened. The investment discussion would continue. Contracts would eventually be signed. Expansion plans would move forward. But the lesson he would remember had nothing to do with business. It was the realization that character often revealed itself long before titles did. The meeting continued for another hour, but the atmosphere was completely different from the one that existed earlier in the afternoon. What began as a discussion about funding had gradually become something deeper. The numbers still mattered. The projections still appeared on screens. Yet beneath every conversation ran a quieter understanding about leadership, trust, and the kind of people who would shape the future of the company. Outside the conference room windows, Manhattan had fully transformed into a sea of lights. Towers shimmered against the night sky. Traffic moved below like rivers of gold and red. Inside, documents were reviewed, questions were answered, and plans were refined. Darius Whitmore participated thoughtfully, offering insights without dominating the discussion. Each time someone asked for his opinion, he answered directly. Each time praise found its way toward him, he redirected it toward the teams that helped build his success. Ethan Crawford found himself observing more than speaking. That alone was unusual. Throughout most meetings, he naturally occupied the center of attention. Tonight he was learning. As the final presentation concluded, the chairman closed his folder and smiled. I believe we have accomplished everything we needed to accomplish. Several directors nodded in agreement. One by one, people began gathering their materials. Conversations shifted from business to travel plans, family updates, and upcoming events. The formal pressure of the meeting slowly dissolved. Darius stood and shook hands with several board members. Each interaction carried genuine warmth. Ethan watched carefully. The respect people showed Darius had nothing to do with fear. Nobody was trying to impress him. They simply valued him. The difference felt important. As the room gradually emptied, Ethan finally approached. For a moment neither man spoke. The city lights reflected behind them in the glass, creating the illusion that Manhattan itself was standing quietly in the room. I appreciate your willingness to move forward, Ethan said. Darius smiled. Partnerships are built by looking ahead. Ethan nodded. Still, you had every reason not to. Darius considered that for a moment. Maybe. Then he glanced toward the hallway. But my mother taught me something else. Ethan waited. She said that bitterness is expensive. It costs more than most people realize. The words settled deeply. Darius continued. You can spend years carrying a grudge and never notice what it is taking from you. Ethan looked down briefly. The simplicity of the statement made it impossible to dismiss. It was not presented as a lesson. It was simply wisdom earned through experience. A few minutes later, the two men exited the conference room together. As they entered the executive floor hallway, several employees looked up in surprise. Earlier that day, the chief executive had refused to meet the visitor. Now they were walking side by side in quiet conversation. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. They stepped inside. The descent felt strangely peaceful. Neither man rushed to fill the silence. When the doors opened onto the lobby level, Emily immediately looked up from the reception desk. Frank was nearby finishing the last portion of his evening shift. Both recognized Darius immediately. What surprised them was seeing Ethan beside him. Darius approached the desk and smiled. Thank you again for your professionalism. Emily smiled warmly. It was nice meeting you, sir. Then Darius turned toward Frank. And thank you for the conversation. Frank laughed. You made the afternoon more interesting than usual. They shook hands. Ethan stood quietly beside them, taking in the scene. Earlier he would have walked through the lobby without noticing any of it. Tonight felt different. Tonight he noticed the receptionist. He noticed the janitor. He noticed the people who kept the building running long after executives went home. And somehow, that realization felt every bit as valuable as the investment agreement waiting upstairs. The revolving doors opened, and the cool Manhattan night greeted them as they stepped outside. The city felt different after sunset. The glass towers shimmered beneath thousands of lights. Streams of traffic flowed through the avenues. The sounds of distant horns, conversations, and passing footsteps blended into the familiar rhythm of New York. Darius Whitmore paused near the entrance and looked up at the building stretching high above him. For a brief moment, memories overlapped with the present. Decades earlier, he had stood outside office buildings like this one waiting for his mother to finish cleaning floors long after executives had gone home. Back then, success felt impossibly far away. Yet she had always spoken as though the future was larger than the circumstances around them. Ethan Crawford stopped beside him. Neither man spoke immediately. The evening air carried a quiet stillness between them. Across the street, office workers hurried toward restaurants and train stations. A black sedan waited nearby to take Darius to his hotel. You know, Ethan finally said, I spent most of my career believing I could read people quickly. Darius smiled faintly. A lot of people believe that. Ethan shook his head. The problem is that confidence can become blindness. The honesty surprised even him. A few months earlier he would never have admitted something like that aloud. Darius looked toward the city lights. We all have blind spots. Ethan nodded slowly. Some are more expensive than others. Both men laughed softly. The tension that once existed between them had disappeared. Not because the afternoon had been forgotten, because it had been understood. A few feet away, the chairman exited the building and joined them. The board is very excited about the partnership, he said warmly. As am I, Darius replied. The chairman smiled. I thought you might be. After a few final conversations, handshakes were exchanged and goodbyes were offered. The evening was coming to an end, yet something important lingered beneath the business agreements and investment plans. Ethan felt it as he watched Darius prepare to leave. Throughout the day he had witnessed wealth, influence, and success. Yet none of those things had been the most impressive part of the man. What stayed with him instead was the image of Darius sitting patiently in the lobby, talking with a receptionist, helping a janitor, waiting without bitterness, holding on to dignity when nobody else in the building recognized his value. The driver opened the sedan door. Darius paused before stepping inside. He glanced back at the building one final time. High above, lights still glowed from executive offices. Somewhere inside, employees were finishing reports. Security guards were beginning overnight shifts. Cleaning crews would soon arrive to prepare the building for another day. The same cycle his mother once knew so well. A small smile appeared on his face. Then he entered the vehicle. The sedan pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the moving river of city traffic. Ethan remained standing outside the building long after it was gone. The chairman eventually returned inside. Employees headed home. The sidewalk gradually emptied. Yet Ethan continued looking down the avenue where the car had vanished. For the first time in years, he found himself noticing people he would normally overlook. A maintenance worker locking a service entrance. A delivery driver unloading packages. A security guard greeting a stranger with a smile. Ordinary people carrying stories he knew nothing about. The city had not changed. The building had not changed. The investment had not changed. What changed was the way he saw them. Above him, the lights of Manhattan reflected across the glass tower. Somewhere beyond those reflections, the future partnership would create opportunities, jobs, and growth. But the most valuable thing that happened that day could not be measured on a spreadsheet. A chief executive learned that character reveals itself long before status does. And a man who was underestimated once again proved that true worth never needs to announce itself. It simply waits for people willing to see it.